welcome to another episode of the Canadian Podcow, everyone. I'm Sarah Sash. I'm here with my colleague Andrew Campbell. Good to see you again.
It's wonderful to see you, Sarah. You are back in BC after a lovely trip here to Ontario, although not to Southern Ontario, but you love going to Ottawa all the time.
I do love Ontario. Beautiful place. Beautiful place.
Well, and right now, actually, it's fairly reasonable, too. It's sunny, it's warm, it's like winter has finally, and I would say it wasn't not like spring was wintry, but it was just cold all the time. So I think you talked to an Ontario farmer this week. They are smiling and feeling like it is.
Yeah, I rolled into the yard from the airport last night and it looked like a UFO was landing in my field because Gene was out there with all his blue lights on his sprayer. So he's got his corn sprayed. Life is good. I think we're getting into the zone where I'm like, it's June on Monday. So...
Well, you know what? It's actually funny because somebody sent me, they're saying, what times work for you? And they sent times in June. And I was like, how busy are they that they're sending me available times in June? And then I realized all of the times were for next week. So
yeah, my kids have started to tell me all the days, like how many days left of school, all that sort of thing. So we're getting to that point in the year.
Yours to mine too, and all figuring out where they want to know what all the summer plans are. And I'm like, can I just finish planting soybeans first? Then we can talk about summer.
And if you don't have enough things to think about, we're going to dive into some new topics today because there are newly released changes to proAction. DFC has finally finalized the new requirements for housing of calves, dry cattle, and lactating cattle in the animal care module.
And if you are an avid Podcow listener, then you'll know that these are lining up with a code of practice for care and handling of dairy cattle that was published in March of 2023 that we've actually talked about in the past.
So these new requirements we've been talking about for a while will become part of on-farm validations beginning in April 2027. So you have a bit of time to get ready, not all the way till this time next year. And we'll break down what producers need to know moving forward.
So the next step is how Canada's dairy sector is going to continue to evolve, improve, and obviously prepared for the future, and what those changes really do like when it comes to cow comfort and how they're going to move around your barn.
So whether you're a dairy farmer, an industry partner, or you're simply interested in sustainability and animal care in Canadian agriculture, let's dive into these proAction changes right now on the Canadian Podcow. Our guest today grew up in British Columbia and always had a lifelong interest in dairy cows. His interest in animal science continued as an undergraduate student at the University of British Columbia, where he had the opportunity to participate in dairy cow research. That led to an interest in nutritional management as well as cow behavior, which he studied during his graduate program at UBC. He then completed a one-year postdoctoral position with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at the Lethbridge Research Centre.
In 2007, he began working with the University of Guelph. He leads a highly productive research program focused on dairy cattle behavior, nutrition, health, management, and welfare, basically everything there is to do with dairy cattle. As an academic, he was co-chair of the Dairy Cattle Code of Practice Scientific Committee. In addition to his research responsibilities, he also contributes to teaching at the university, including instructing undergraduate and graduate courses in the areas of dairy cattle management, behavior, and welfare, as well as coaching at the university Dairy Challenge team. Trevor DeVries, welcome to the Canadian Podcow. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here.
Trevor, it's great to have you on the podcast today, and we will talk about proAction. But first, I'm curious, talk to us about the Dairy Challenge. What is that?
Yeah, that's probably one of the most exciting things as part of my job. It's a teaching commitment of mine. We teach a senior undergraduate class called Dairy Challenge, which basically in that class we put students in groups of 4 and have them evaluate dairy farm enterprises. And so students get access to all the information about the farm, all records, diet information, management information, cow production records, health records, etc. We go to the farm with the students and then they put a presentation together to really evaluate challenges that the farm might be experiencing and then provide solutions, opportunities for the farm to implement, whereby they have to also put an economic return on that for the farmer as well. And so that's a class that we teach, but then out of that class, we select students to go to competitions as well. And so there's a national competition every year that happens typically in the US. that we attend, and compete with anywhere from 32 to 36 other schools. And the University of Guelph and our team has traditionally done very well. We've had numerous first and second place finishes in that competition. And yeah, like I said, I'm very proud of that program and our class and the job that our students do within that.
Well, you should be proud, because I have heard of lots of folks who have either gone through it, or I've even heard of other, whether they're programs or things like that, trying to not necessarily copy, but use your example as a way to try to grow the knowledge, especially around the business and the management side of dairy farms. So congratulations on all the work to do with that. You also had a very big job when it comes to proAction. Maybe not quite as exciting as all of that in terms of the course, because it is fun, but it is one of those things that is really important for us as dairy producers in terms of what can we expect. DFC has finalized new requirements for the proAction animal care module. You were that scientific committee lead in terms of what those changes are. Can you tell us, maybe step back before we get right into the changes, what does that process look like, from your perspective in trying to put some of these rules together?
Yeah, well, I guess this goes back to the code, right? And the code underwent a revision process, as hopefully most people are aware of. And that process, as it was originally developed through NFAC, the National Farm Animal Care Council, that process in the revision, so to speak, was very similar in terms of bringing together not only the dairy farmers themselves, but then also the various stakeholders in the industry, veterinarians, scientists, animal advocacy groups, and other industry stakeholders, and really on a consensus-based model, right, come up with updated and new code requirements based on science that basically say, hey, these are things that the industry should be doing, because we know that at the end of the day, they are things that are good for the welfare of the animals and the care that we take of them. And at the same time, these things, when we do these things, they also have benefits to us from a health, production, efficiency standpoint, right? And so, and the idea is that these are, things that are also, practical to be implemented on our dairy farms. And so those, that new code was released in 2023. And then as part of the Animal Care Technical Committee that works on implementing that, those code requirements into proAction, of which I also sit on that committee, we've been working in terms of developing the framework, or the updated framework, so to speak, to actually implement the evaluation of those code requirements on farm.
So this is certainly a big, big job. A lot of work goes into this. There's all types of committees and acronyms, as you pointed out. Yes. It's nice to have someone in the dairy system actually spell out the acronym, because lots of us know them, but lots of people don't keep up with all of this. So thanks for doing that. We mentioned previously that housing was the focus of these changes. There are two separate groups being affected, if I understand it correctly, which I darn well should, which is unweaned calves and dry and lactating cattle.
Yeah, there's a variety of different updates made to the code. Some of the bigger ones, as you pointed out, were related to those groups, right? So calves, pre-weaned calves specifically, and then dry cows and lactating cows. And really, I'd say overarching is the fact that these improvements were generally targeted at really improving comfort, social interactions, as well as freedom of movement of those classes of animals.
And when are these new requirements coming into effect finally, after all this process and preamble and figuring? When does it need to be implemented on farm?
Yeah, and so in reality, the code took effect as of 2023 with its release. And so the requirements, in fact, kind of apply at that point. However, as it relates to proAction and the evaluation of those requirements on farm, that really doesn't get rolling until next year, till 2027, at which these new and updated code requirements will be evaluated on farm. For some of them, though, and and as we'll discuss, some of them are not immediate implementations. And so while the code came out in 2023, some of the new requirements have kind of delays built into them. And so there are some that say don't really come into effect until 2029 or 2031, for example, based on the individual specific kind of code requirements.
Can we talk about the science side of it a little bit, Trevor, just from the perspective of when we do talk about calf housing requirements for the code, where does the science, you mentioned things like comfort and social interactions and all of that, your role from the scientific committee, how do you kind of weave that in, what the research talks about, into a code like this?
Yeah, and so part of, and that was part of my role as co-chair of the scientific committee, and the role of the scientific committee in general is to work on specific areas, high priority research areas that are going to be helpful to the code development committee in terms of coming up with these requirements. And so, as I mentioned before, the code, if you look at the framework for the code itself, like it has to be the requirements within that have to be science-based. And so we as a scientific committee, our role is to inform that, so to speak, to say, okay, we know we have data, right? Good scientific data, a lot of that Canadian produced as well, right? And that's something that the Dairy Farmers of Canada has taken pride in itself over the years, right? That they invest in independent research that's being done at universities. And a lot of the work that we rely on comes from work that we've done here, but also globally in terms of looking at, right, what science tells us and then taking that information and applying it to these updated code requirements. And so, for example, on the calf side of things, right, we're looking at changes to calf housing requirements. And a lot of that's based on work that's been done in the last 10 to 20 years of research suggesting that, there is benefits from not only a welfare perspective, but also from a health, efficiency, production standpoint when we give calves, for example, more social contact or better resting space or resting conditions, right? And we see the benefits of those from a science standpoint and then, in practice as well.
So on the requirement side, what are the new housing requirements for unweaned calves under the updated proAction animal care module?
Yeah, and so there was updates made to the kind of pre-weaned calf housing requirements, as well as some new and additional things. And so, similar to the previous code, calves basically, still have to be able to stand, lie down comfortably, be able to turn around, groom themselves, have visual contact with other cattle. No, that hasn't really changed. That was in place as it was. But again, it's good to highlight those things because those are very important things for kind of normal behavior, resting, standing behavior of calves, even grooming behavior, etc. The updates have come particularly around freedom of movement. So, for example, in the revised code now, in the current code, the indoor calves are no longer allowed to be tethered as part of normal calf housing. So when we've got calves that are in some kind of indoor facility, which is defined as basically a building with four walls, closable walls, so to speak, in that case, those animals, cannot be tethered as part of their normal housing. And then the other major one is that as of 2031, and so this is one of those ones with a phase-in period, the requirement is that healthy calves will need to be pair housed or group housed by 4 weeks of age. And so there would be a requirement that at the point of about 4 weeks, 28 days of age, calves should be either in pairs or some type of group housing arrangement.
So then why is that, you talked about that kind of visual and physical contact that really is beneficial for the welfare of that calf. What does the research say? What are those benefits that it really does bring for that animal?
Yeah, and that's an interesting one because a lot of this requirement and then other places where similar type of requirements have been put in place, the science is pretty clear. Like it's really clear actually, and it's based on the fact that cattle in general are social animals, right? And so they benefit from being in a social environment and having social contact. And there's been a large number of studies, research done over the last, I'm going to say 20 years now, where people have demonstrated that, yeah, when we house calves in pairs at minimum, that's kind of the minimum definition of a socially housed animal, into small groups or even larger groups, we see benefits from a behavioral standpoint where those animals tend to learn quicker. They adapt to new environments quicker. And so they feed off a little bit. There's some really neat research showing that they're more cognitively flexible, which basically means that, right, like they can adapt to new situations quicker, whether that's a new housing situation, whether that's a new feeding situation. And so weaning success seems to be much quicker and better in general when we have that. And so that social contact and seems to play a role in terms of that behavioral development, which then translates into these easier transitions, which also translates into things like better growth and better intakes in those animals, particularly at those more stressful time periods like weaning.
And we're not talking about just pairing together any calves. I remember all this discussion about healthy, thriving, and compatible, right? You got to have two calves that really should be suited to being together and are healthy and ready to go. But how do the new requirements improve comfort and resting conditions for these guys or these girls, once they're together in a group housing system?
Yeah, and that's the thing too, right? And we have to make sure of that. And it's a good point that there are caveats on these things, right? Like we want to make sure that we're putting these management systems in place to allow the animals to thrive and do well, right? More than just thrive, right? To excel, so to speak, from a health perspective, from a performance standpoint. And yeah, if you are having health challenges with the calves, that's not necessarily going to allow for that, right? And again, too, we want to make sure that, yeah, calves don't have to compete, for example. Like you don't want a newborn calf paired with an 8-week-old calf, right? Where that newborn's going to be bullied away from feed and whatever else have you. And so managing those things well becomes very important. Having those other elements that I mentioned before that were always kind of part of the code, right? Having good, comfortable resting surfaces, right? Adequate space, even good air and ventilation, right? Which again is a requirement for all animals, right? To have fresh air becomes even that much more important in those situations from a cattle health and welfare perspective.
Now you mentioned so on the indoor setting for those calves, you can't tether them anymore. That can't be part of the system, and they need to be paired once they're a month old. What's the difference once we go outside? Lots of farmers around here are using calf hutches. Is tethering them in a calf hutch show? Like where are the rules versus indoor versus outdoor?
That's a question that people come up with and saying, well, can we not use hutches anymore? And definitely hutches are still allowable under new code requirements. There are some requirements around that. For example, you can tether the animals, so to speak. However, they have to be able to do all those things that I talked about before. So they have to be able to get up and down easily. They have to be able to turn around, right? They also have to be able to have physical contact with their neighbor, right? And so if you've got animals that are in hutches that are tethered, they have to be able to walk outside their hutch basically and have direct physical contact with a calf in a neighboring hutch. For those that are using hutches where they might have a small fenced-in area in front of the hutch, right, that would then require those to be directly beside each other where they could have that direct physical contact. And so that's pretty well the kind of the difference there with that outdoor housing.
Well, thanks, Trevor. This is all super informative, and there's a lot more to talk about. We've talked about calves. I could talk about that the whole episode, but right after the break, we're going to talk about changes to dry and lactating cattle housing. Stay right there.
Strong, and free. It's not just in our anthem, it's in who we are. A freedom to choose what's best for us. That's why Canadian dairy farmers uphold some of the highest standards in the world, proudly helping to strengthen our communities. When you choose Canadian, you're making all of us stronger.
That's the Canadian way.
And we're back with Trevor DeVries, professor at the University of Guelph. Trevor, want to move on from calves into housing for dry and lactating cows. What are some of the biggest housing changes as part of the new proAction requirements that dairy farmers are going to notice with these changes?
Yeah, and so similar to our discussion on calves, some of the themes related to housing for adult cattle, both dry cows, lactating cows, include improvements in terms of freedom of movement of cattle, reducing negative effects of overcrowding and competition, as well as enhancing, in general, cow comfort. And so we have new requirements related to stocking density, to maternity pen use, particularly for tie stall facilities, and also reducing kind of long-term continuous tethering of animals in those tie systems.
A major theme throughout these updates is cow comfort and welfare. So similar to the calves, we want to make sure the girls are super comfortable. And stocking density is one of those things. I think we all know people who have said, oh, we probably ourselves have sold cows and then said, hey, our milk actually went up because things are suddenly a little more comfortable in the barn. So why has stocking density become such an important focus, and what impact can overcrowding have on cows?
Yeah, and it's a loaded topic, so to speak. We could have a whole webinar, even a day seminar on kind of the effects, and we've done those kind of trainings in the past. But basically, really, what it comes down to is cows have a time budget that they need to fulfill in their day. They need to spend so much time lying down. They need to spend so much time eating. They need to ruminate as well, most of that while they're lying down. They also need to drink, and as lactating cows, they need to milk. And so the reality is that even though there's 24 hours in a day, I always say, and the sum total of those individual time budget behaviors doesn't even equal 24 hours, what we know is that when we overcrowd the resources cows have, whether that's resting space, whether that's a lying stall or just square footage on the ground, so to speak, whether that's feed bunk space, water space, even cows per robot, for example, in a robotic milking system, we know that will have an effect on their behavior. And typically, again, the research is pretty clear that typically that's a negative effect, right? If we put more cows in our stalls, we see a reduction in lying time. With that, we'll see reductions in rumination time. There might even be changes in eating time and intakes on cows. And so all those things work together, and we see negative outcomes associated with that. Probably the most common, like with stocking density of stalls or spaces, cows spend more time standing, less time resting. That, again, negatively affects rumination, might negatively affect intake and production. But if you've got cows that are standing longer than they're supposed to, what's the other thing we see? Well, we often see more foot problems. We see more lameness in cows, right? And so those things are very well established in research. And so, and again, some of those things like lameness, right, are obviously clear negative kind of effects or have negative effects on the welfare of cows. And so, the emphasis has been placed on let's minimize the risk of those negative things from happening and really allow those cows to optimize their time budgets. And so a lot of that has driven this discussion or drove our discussion on this topic area and drove kind of the decision towards reducing the effects of competition and putting limits on the stocking densities of the cows.
So that's one big emphasis on the changes. The other one is around kind of freedom of movement. Why is freedom of movement, again, going kind of to the research side of it, so important for that animal?
Yeah, and it goes back to our discussion that we had related to the calves. Again, knowing that cattle are, social animals. They are highly motivated to not only socialize, but then also a part of that to move and be able to express natural behaviors. And if we don't provide those, right, those animals are lacking those ability to fulfill those kind of behavioral needs that they might have, so to speak. And when we do provide them, the research, demonstrates again, or the research that we have would demonstrate that we see improvements in terms of things like, lameness, better hoof health in cows, fewer injuries, just overall general behavioral patterns indicative of better comfort and better welfare outcomes. And collectively, in many of those cases, we see then improvements in the productive performance of those animals as well.
So we do have a lot of different types of housing systems here in Canada. What does freedom of movement actually look like in practice on a dairy farm?
Yeah, and like you said, that does vary considerably by the type of housing that we might have, right? And so when we're thinking of loose housing systems, whether you're a freestall barn or you're some kind of pack system, whether that's a compost bedded pack or a different type of pack system, right? That's generally just, allowing those cows the freedom to, right, walk around, right, choose a stall, choose a place to lie down on the pack, whatever that might be. For tie barns, right, where the cow, is potentially tied to her stall via some kind of tether, right, for a portion of the day. The idea is to provide that animal with some type of outdoor access or exercise yard or some opportunity for untethered movement, right? So where the animal can actually get up, walk around, spend time potentially socializing, right? And they can do that freely, so to speak, without being confined to their individual stall.
So let's talk a little more about that, because I think that's kind of an important one to discuss when we do talk about the tie stall systems. What does that look like in practice for a producer in that system? What are some of the things that they're going to have to think through in terms of cows going outside or whatever that looks like day to day or month to month, depending on the weather?
Tie stall farms will need to provide cows regular opportunities for exercise and untethered movement. The exact approach is going to be vary between farms, right? Really depending on their facilities and management. And so for some farms, they're going to be able to do that every day, right? And so that could mean allowing cows out every day for an hour into an exercise yard or a paddock, right, where they can do that. For some farms, that might be more difficult, and so there's also an allowance within the code that could be, again, for existing facilities, right, that have had to retrofit to this requirement, that they might restrict that to keeping cows or allowing that untethered kind of portion of the day during only their dry period, for example, right? And so the idea behind the code requirement was to allow cows that freedom of movement for a reasonable portion of their day and time, but also recognizing that, again, we have some older existing facilities where that might be more difficult. And so we wanted to provide some flexibility within that, where people could think a little bit outside the box, so to speak, in terms of, okay, I can't do it maybe every day for my lactating cows. Let's focus on the dry cows and at least get them that opportunity to be able to do that.
So we did touch on this a little bit already, but can you talk about the health and productivity benefits associated with giving cows more space and this opportunity to move about naturally?
As I mentioned before, the biggest thing there is really just that, again, that freedom to express natural behavior, which is going to, again, allow that cow to optimize or at least similar to what we talked about with stocking density, right? Allow that cow to optimize her time budget in terms of spend the time that she needs to lying down and resting and ruminating, but also eating, but then also do so that she can do so comfortably. And again, the research would suggest that when we do that, we see improvements in terms of we see less hoof pathologies, right? Less lameness, less other injuries to the cattle, whether that's to the knees, hocks, or other body parts on those animals. We see more rest time overall, and just that general support of better and more natural behavior. And again, every kind of study out there is a little different, but the common theme is that, yeah, when we do those things, we see improvements in terms of health, and we see productive benefits associated with those things as well.
Now, one of the other changes that I do know is there's not a ton of stanchion barns left in Canada, but there's not zero. And one of the important changes is the phase out and moving away from stanchion barns altogether. Can you explain why that is being phased out and how that may affect, kind of the day-to-day management for those few producers that are in Canada still using that system?
Yeah, and again, like you said, it's not a housing system that we see a lot of necessarily in the industry. Really, at the end of the day, stanchions will reduce kind of normal, resting behavior in cows. If you've ever seen cows get up and down that are kept in a stanchion, it can be, again, it depends on the design, but can be restrictive, making it hard for that animal to stand up and lie down easily, just like it can be in other stall systems as well, right? And so it comes back to a little bit around the design. But the biggest thing is actually the resting behavior itself, and it really restricts kind of normal resting postures in dairy cows, right? And if you ever watch cows rest, like you'll see a variety of different postures from a body position, but then also a head and neck position. And so when the cow's in a stanchion, right, she's really restricted to kind of one limited way of kind of keeping her head and the position of that. And so that's really, having a negative impact on the resting kind of behavior of that cow and the ability of that cow to do so in a manner that, is most comfortable for her and what works best, right? And so, so that requirement to phase out is really kind of with that in mind, right? Where we want to optimize the behavior of the animal, and this is clearly viewed as a challenge to that. And so, those that would be using stanchions yet are going to have to think about how to accommodate that, either getting rid of those and just going to tie a rail system with a tether on there, or moving towards loose housing type system.
And just thinking a little bit about the calving management side of it, I understand that loose-housed maternity areas will become mandatory in 2029 or by 2029. What does that transition involve, and how are farms beginning to prepare for this?
Really, the idea is that, cows need sufficient space, right? And if you've ever watched a cow have a calf, right, and give birth, right, you know that she's just not standing there still, and necessarily, and even her resting posture is going to change, and she takes up a lot more space than we would typically see if she was confined, for example, in a stall. And so again, we want those animals to have sufficient space that they can do so freely, right? And so we want them to be able to do so in some type of pen type system, right? And so the long-term goal there again is that those cows would have sufficient space to do that within some kind of maternity pen or yard. And so those farms that were, say, calving out cows in stalls, right, are going to have to think about creating that kind of space, either within their existing cow barn or creating a suitable space elsewhere that those cows can do that within.
So it is, quite a number of changes, kind of something for every stage of animal, whether it is, one of those things you talked about in terms of calves or, dry cows and calvings or lactating cows, things like that. And overcrowding, it probably is one of those where each and every one of us as producers do need to look through this new module, look through the changes, think through how it's going to impact, their farm. I guess I'm kind of wondering what you think, if you were giving advice to a producer who's kind of going through this process, trying to introduce themselves to what these changes are. What are some of the most important things they should be assessing, monitoring, and potentially redesigning if they do have to from current facilities to make some changes down the road?
Yeah, and again, I think every farm's unique, right? And as you kind of pointed out, and everyone out there probably just needs to really, I guess, first and foremost, kind of take a critical look and probably involve their advisory teams in that, right? As far as whether or not they clearly are meeting current requirements and those that are upcoming. And in those cases where they might not be, or it might be a challenge to do so, is to think about, right, whether or not they can make modifications or renovations to their existing facilities that will allow them to meet those, right? And so, and again, there are sometimes with some of these things, it might be quite cost effective, right? Modifications that need to be made in a simply to achieve those things. Some might be a little bit more complex. It's really going to depend on the situation. But then at the other side of things, and that's with anything in life, like dairy facilities, we know have a limited lifespan, right? Just like the car you drive, or maybe even the house you live in, right? Or other structures that are out there, right? There's only so long that those things can last, both from a longevity standpoint, but even from, right, meeting kind of the current needs, so to speak, of what they're being used for. And so, while we can kind of repair and modify those to some degree, at some point you have to consider replacement as well. And that is a much tougher decision, right? And again, there has to be some, strong economic kind of considerations made within those. But again, at the end of the day, producers are going to have to take those critical looks at things and realize that in some of those cases, those kind of decisions will have to be made. And ideally, at the end of the day, you're going to see benefits from a cow health, welfare, performance standpoint. And a lot of producers who make those kind of changes too often to their cow comfort often also feel it themselves, which is really interesting. And there's some really neat research out there too, suggesting that, right? Like, we know that the health and performance of cows is often linked to, the general kind of feeling of the producers that take care of them as well. And so if you as a dairy farmer, right, are also more comfortable in the environment, right, and you perceive that the cows are, I think those things work really well together. And so really at the end of the day, it's going back to, evaluating what are the challenges, what are my opportunities within what I've got, and sometimes, thinking beyond that as well.
Well, certainly a lot to think about on farm, and something for everyone, as Andrew pointed out, but also really evident the amount of thought that has gone into preparing these changes and to making them successful for Canadian dairy farmers. So Trevor DeVries, thank you so much for joining us on the Canadian Podcow.
No problem. Thank you for the invite.
So as we wrap up for today, Andrew, there's a lot to take in from these updated proAction requirements. I feel like the direction is pretty clear in terms of space, movement, et cetera, but I love the message that Trevor left us with about farmer well-being also, that actually sometimes when you make these changes, it turns out better for you too.
Well, and just kind of putting yourself in almost that cow's mindset too, in terms of, recognizing that when you're comfortable, you do better. When they're comfortable, they do better. And it is one of those, you mentioned it, talking to Trevor, in terms of funny how, you pull cows out when you're trying to trim the herd down a little bit, and all of a sudden milk goes up, and you're like, wait a minute, this wasn't supposed to happen, but does speak to, kind of just one of those realities. But I really certainly appreciated, from Trevor's perspective, that that idea that this really, there are rules, there are standards in it, but there's not really this one-size-fits-all change to it. It really is about trying to, be aware that there are new barns, there are old barns, there are big barns, there are little barns, there are a whole bunch of different setups, and how does it kind of work for individual producers, even if there are some changes to make.
Yeah, welcome to Canada, vast country, all types of things going on here. So, especially in the dairy industry, we got all different weather, we got different housing, and that's really where management comes into play. It's not just about your infrastructure, it's about planning, scheduling, figuring out when the opportunities for exercise are happening, all these things. So, Andrew, if you had one kind of leave behind or key takeaway from all of this, what would it be?
Well, I think it is just recognizing, for me, what these standards are now and starting to plan. There are, and some of them we're still talking 5 or 6 years away from even, needing to do that. But it still is one of those, as you invest in the barn, as you're fixing things up, as you're going to farm shows, as you're doing all of these things, start to plan a little early in terms of what that might look like. And even using some of these examples, I think it can always be a testament to, if you are going to make changes, there's these changes and kind of looking ahead, through the code to see what future changes might be, and just recognizing that cow comfort, movement of cows, all of those is clearly a clear priority for what, the code of conduct is going to look like.
I was just really hoping that you were going to say stay proactive like it says in our notes.
Stay proactive. When have I ever read a script that we're given, Sarah? It's just not my style. I come away with real things.
Proactive farmer.
It always does throw our guests off too when I never read from anything
True
either.
facts. Well, that's a great way to put it. We would like to thank you all for joining us today. Give us a follow on Blue Sky, on X, Facebook, YouTube, or drop us a note by email at podcast@canadianpodcow.ca.
Of course, as always, this podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of the Dairy Farms of Canada and the work behind the scenes from our production team, Bruce Sargent and Carl Belanger. Thanks, everyone, for listening. I'm Andrew Campbell.
And I'm Sarah Sash. Bye for now.